Well, hi guys. A bank holiday Sunday, 90 miles from my house, and we're at the National Radio Centre run by the Radio Society of Great Britain up here in Bletchley Park. Being a bank holiday in the UK, you know what I'm going to say. Yes, it's raining, and we will try and get some outside information for you, but yes, it's raining. In the reception area of the National Radio Centre, as you walk in, there's some interesting displays. There's a rolling demonstration running on a computer. There's also a couple of radios that are dotted around from the era of World War II. One that is particularly interesting to me is an HRO, because I own one. I believe there's a Colin's down on the floor as well. So got the lids off so people can see inside. And hopefully we're going to bring you some more very interesting information as we wander around the National Radio Centre here at Bletchley Park. As you enter the National Radio Centre, there's effectively a one-way system. You enter, and the first thing you see is a video on display and takes you through radio, what radio actually is, the bit of a history of radio, right from the very early days right up to modern radio devices like mobile phones. So it's a completely comprehensive video. As we move around into the next part, around the corner, there are a number of static displays, various old radios in perspex boxes, and a bit further along there is a cabinet on the wall that must have something like about 120 valves, or as our American correspondents would call it, tubes in them. Phenomenal. And I suppose if somebody really wanted to have a bit of fun, you could run a competition to see how many valves you could actually identify. I'm going to fail miserably because there are very few that I recognise. But we're moving along. There's some other interesting transceivers in boxes as we move down the corner of the Radio Centre. We come across some interesting display units that I used to like in the old days when I was at the Science Museum. They're units that allow you to twiddle knobs and see things happen. There's a oscillator here showing how to pick up signal strength, how to tune a signal in, as a bar graph. There's another one showing as you move a tuning circuit how the frequency changes, and a whole raft of interesting devices as I move down the corridor here, all about radio, oscillators, bandwidth, modulation, antennas, and all those sort of things. So kind of it's an interesting display of how radios actually work. So very worthwhile looking. On the other side of the wall is a spectrum timeline which shows lots of interesting information of the various bands, from all the way down from LF right up to the multi-gigahertz bands, and shows you a few applications that run on it.
We caught up with Simone Wilson, Mike Zero Bravo Oscar X-Ray, who's an RSGB director, who told us about the visitor numbers and the passion behind the people at the National Radio Centre.
It's not stopped the general public actually wandering through, has it? We've had quite a lot of people wander around today.
Oh, we have had a lot of people. The National Radio Centre has become actually one of the go-to places on a visit to Bletchley Park. Of the number of visitors per day, we'd expect anything like 25 to 30% of those visitors to stop into the centre to say hello. We're on reasonably well one of the routes round so they wander past the door and they go, oh, it's nice, and we'll pop in. So yes, we've seen a huge increase, and that is in no part down to it's all down to Martin and his team of volunteers who are so professional in what they do in presenting our hobby to the general public.
Yeah, and certainly, I mean, this is not my first visit. This is my third visit to the National Radio Centre. First time we've done it on the podcast, but every time I've come here, the presenters have been very professional, very passionate about our hobby. And if you've got passionate people talking about our hobby in a passionate way, that's certainly engaging for the general public, isn't it?
Oh, very much so. There's so much to talk about. You've got the Fun Cube, which we're demonstrating all the time, and it sort of amazes people that this little tiny plastic box that we give them is the same size as a Funsat, and there's several of these whizzing around, and we can track them from here, and we get all the data from the experiments they're carrying on board. From that to we've got we're monitoring FT8 signals all the time. It is actually amazing what is being done here by the volunteer crew.
Martin is the kind of the boss.
Is the title.
Coordinator.
Yes, NRC coordinator.
I'd have put you as the boss, but there you go. Martin, what's your call sign? And give us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, thanks indeed. The call sign is G0GMB. I've been that for a number of years now, but I did actually start life as G8KGF. I took my license when I was 21 at university, and before that I was an enthusiastic listener, and in fact when I started off I was A7077, going back quite a few years now. So I've been into amateur radio for about 50 years, I should think, and I was introduced by my uncle who lived down in the Harrow area. He was G3 HBR, Brian Hummerstone, and he was the guy that got me interested in amateur radio in the first place.
Now, when we were talking earlier, before we got the gear out, you were telling us that you felt that the bit that everybody knows about with Bletchley Park is the code breaking. But you said that you described it as a triangle, which I thought was quite an interesting way of discussing it, how radio fitted in. So I wonder if you'd tell our listeners how you described it to me.
Yes, certainly. Well, in the reception area of the NRC, we've tried to set up some degree of continuity. If you think that 90% of our visitors come through the door because they've come to Bletchley Park, they're expecting to see something relevant to Bletchley Park. And really, of course, wireless is the key for that, because Bletchley Park, apart from a very short period of time in the war, didn't have any radio stations here. It was all about the decoding the messages, and if there had been wireless stations here, the aerials or the transmissions would have given away the secrecy of the place. So in the reception area, we have a number of Second World War receivers, CR100, AR88, HRO, and we try and set the scene about wireless and the importance of it to Bletchley Park, because if there were no messages or transmissions received, there would have been nothing sent to Bletchley Park to be decoded. And then, having decoded the messages and having analysed the military intelligence, that military intelligence had to be got out to the field, to the commanders, the Allied commanders, to act upon, and that again entailed wireless to get the messages out. So it really was a triage of activity, of which Bletchley Park was obviously the core. It was the breaking of the codes, but without the initial messages and without the ultra intelligence getting out, there would have been nothing happening.
Yeah, and the radio operators, let's be honest about it, the radio operators would have had to have been very accurate on what they were recording, because it was in code, so you couldn't read it. You couldn't say, oh, well, actually that word means this because I've got that character wrong. So if their accuracy had to be paramount, I would suggest.
Yes, indeed. And of course, I wasn't around in the time, but this is what we're hearing. I mean, there were two groups of people who were primarily involved in the reception of the messages that came to Bletchley Park. Initially, there were the military wireless intercept stations, which were manned by military personnel and by GPO staff, and they were predominantly listening for the military traffic in occupied Europe. But then there was this huge worry that there were agents or spies being dropped into Britain, who would have been using low power communication equipment to get that information back to their commanders. And that's where the voluntary interceptors were brought in through Lord Sandhurst, through the RSGB, to become the ears around the country. Because if those operators were using 5 to say 20 watts and they were on kind of 5 to 7 megahertz, the ground wave was very limited around there, so they needed multiple operators listening out for enemy transmissions. And these voluntary interceptors, who were initially part of MI8, became MI5 because they were listening internally in the country. But then once they determined that there were no spies left in Britain that had been dropped in, they were then the voluntary interceptors were asked to listen for the Secret Service messages in occupied Europe, and hence became part of MI6, listening externally to the country. And these voluntary interceptors, their core office was based at Hanslope Park, which is now, of course, Hanslope Park, the Diplomatic Wireless Service. So really the work of the voluntary interceptors was the foundation for Hanslope Park as we know it today.
Yeah. Now, just a quickie, and you may not know this, do any of the ex-wireless operators from those years come back and see Bletchley Park and pop in here?
Yes, the answer is yes. There is a reunion of Bletchley Park veterans, whether that is just code breakers or operators or wrens or whatever, I don't really know, but there is a reunion that happens once a year, and there is also a reunion of the voluntary interceptors that happens once a year. There are, to be honest, there are not many of them left now. Bob King is one of the guys, Pete Windle is another, and they come up here each year, and I was at that reunion a couple of months ago. So the numbers of actual VIs has dwindled a lot, but there is an enthusiastic following of sons or daughters who want to continue the involvement of them. So yes, there are reunions here.
It's been a great day for us. Have you got any plans going forward? With anything going to happen here in Bletchley Park?
Well, there's obviously a lot of things that need to be considered. As I mentioned earlier on, I've only been on board since January, and in that time we've tried to make repairs to equipment which has degraded over the years. We've put in a new low frequency aerial, low frequency top band through to 10 meter fan dipole. We're having the tower that supports the stepper IR beam, we're having that renovated with new guy wires and footing improvements. We've added FT8 and some new, we've had an IT refresh with some new PCs. So there's been a lot of kind of bringing things up to speed. Once the house is in full order, then that's the time to think about how we take the NRC forward. And there are some thoughts about the future zone, because that was the future zone 6 years ago when the centre opened, but of course SDR, software defined radio, is now in pretty much everyday use, and that's an area which personally I would like to see changed into an engagement zone. But obviously any changes that happen have to be thought through, the design has to be right, making it suitable for people with disabled people, to try and make sure that it looks very professional. And also, of course, if we're going to make changes, it's got to be done in a way that's going to last for a number of years. So it's got to be thought through carefully, and that means good design, it means good investment in whatever we decide to put in there. So that's something that's got to be decided by the RSGB board. It's good enough to have concepts, but it's got to be approved by the board before any changes are made.
Yeah, well, I can understand that. And in fairness, this is a great location. The access is great because you're straight in on the floor, so you've got wheelchair access. There's no ramps inside the building, so there's no real excuse why somebody can't come. It is a really good building on this one, and you do well.
Thank you. I mean, this just taking that idea of the future zone and the redevelopment of my ideal there is it becomes an engagement zone, because one of the things I'd like to introduce here is how people can get best involved in the hobby. You know, to be able to display some starter kits, some low-cost radios, some second-hand radios. My saying is a very simple one. If your 17-year-old son just passed his driving test, you wouldn't be taking him to the Lamborghini, the Ferrari or the Aston Martin garage. You'd be taking him down to look at Seats or Ford Focuses or Ford Fiestas or something of that nature. So it's absolutely brilliant that the manufacturers and the major retailers provide us with top-of-the-range kit here, such as the Flex or the Yaesu FT5000 or the Kenwood TS2000. It's absolutely great that they provide us with top-of-the-range kit, but I think it's imperative that we show how people can get started in the hobby without necessarily spending a fortune.
I was saying to Simone about your current displays in that there are knobs and buttons to push, which is what I remember the Science Museum used to be. But the Science Museum now is just all touchscreen, and that just left me cold. And being able to tune a radio in, I mean, I would guess that a lot of youngsters, people under the age of 20, have never done it because it's all push button or it's all VHF FM transmission in the car. That's pretty much all they've ever done, I would suggest.
Well, I think you're right there, and of course that's an increasing tendency, isn't it? So the fun of tuning and through the crackle and the pop and the whistle and hearing a station that's coming in from the Far East or from the Middle East or South America, I think is really still quite special and helps to capture the imagination of people. And one of the aspects that we've really tried to introduce here is that amateur radio is no longer somebody just sitting in front of a box with a microphone and talking. You know, now we've got computers, we've got the internet, and we try in the NRC to show that it's an integrated hobby so that it makes it relevant to young people as well. It shows that the computers, the internet is involved, and you start looking at things like DX maps, solar ham, the live feed from the International Space Station, whether it's KST chat. You know, these are all tools that enable the hobby to work and make it so much more seamless in the modern world, I think.
So sitting in the National Radio Centre at the operating desk, I'm with Tony. Tony, what's your call sign?
Golf Zero, Lima Alpha X-Ray.
Right, that's a good one. And Tony's at the moment operating GB3RS, which is the radio station at the National Radio Centre. You're sitting in front of a Flex radio at the moment, but there's some really nice equipment here that you have to play with, Tony.
Yes, it is, and we're very fortunate because a lot of the equipment we have here is either donated or loaned to us on a long-time loan. So we have facilities for the most up-to-date equipment, as well as the antennas outside, etc.
Yeah. So tell us about the antennas outside. I've noticed quite a few out there.
Yes, there's quite an array of antennas on the roof of one of the Bletchley Park buildings. We have a step-IR antenna on the roof, which is quite an expensive set, but it also is a very efficient antenna, which works by matching very closely to the resonant frequencies and therefore low SWR. So.
Yeah, that's good. And you've also got some other stations here. I mean, I notice you've got a satellite system here, you've got other bits and pieces, but there's lots of big screens to show who you're working and other bits of information about radio, isn't there?
Yes, that's correct, and I think for the general public that visit Bletchley Park, today, for example, we're expecting 1,500 people to arrive, and the display screens actually display various things like who we're speaking to. We can look at the QRZ site and show the photograph of the person and his location and the equipment that he's using. Yes, you mentioned earlier that we've got many different systems here. We have a data system where we use FT8 to transmit all around the world. And also we've got a very interesting satellite communication with the Fun Cube, which has been going around in space now for about 4 years. It was actually launched 4 years ago, as I say, and switched on from this very radio station. And as the satellite comes over, we're picking up data from space, and more importantly, that's what schools use to download data from space to craft it into science and technology programs.
Yeah, well, I actually own a FunCube dongle for receiving it, and it's a great, interesting information. And I think some amateurs probably not aware of it because we use it to receive. But the actual FunCube dashboard gives you all the data and the telemetry data and the messages from space, doesn't it, Tony?
That's right. And when the public come in to see that, and they bring in children into the radio centre, we encourage them to ask their school teacher in science or technology to see if they're actually linked up to this, because it's a fascinating project. I mean, the Fun Cube itself, most thing that excites people is the Fun Cube. You could hold it in your hand. It's a 10 centimetre cube, and after launching 4 years ago, it's now in space, travelling at 17,000 miles an hour around the Earth. So it takes about 80 to 90 minutes to go around the world. And the data we receive is in easy form to see in the radio centre and indeed in schools, using the dongle, as you said earlier, yes.
So adding space with amateur radio certainly does bring us into the 21st century real time, doesn't it?
It certainly does, and the question then what comes off that, with all the data communications and the space communications, why do we need shortwave these days? What's the point? And the point is really that throughout the world in recent times we've had many disasters, like the Solomon Islands out of water, the Nepal disaster, and the Christchurch disaster. They had 2 earthquakes there, for example, and the amateur radio HF system, when all systems fail in those countries, can be easily set up by radio amateurs, and people who visited the radio centre in the past have been able to listen in to see the requests to Great Britain and other countries for resources and times of aircraft flights to help them with the support.
Yes, it's let's say amateur radio and HF and even old technologies like HF still work very well today. And the other reason sometimes why do we do HF, it's a bit like asking a mountaineer why he climbs Everest, because he can.
Because it's there, that's right, absolutely right. And it is very interesting, because this is the National Radio Centre for the Radio Society of Great Britain, and the very fact that we are here has its history in another direction, in so much that those radio amateurs during World War II who were skilled in Morse code, those services were precious services in those days and used by the secret intelligence services in this country. And the radio amateurs on a daily basis sent information back to a post office box every night, and MI6, if they thought that was of interest, they'd send it into Bletchley Park to be decoded alongside the German battlefield codes, which were picked up by radio stations all around the world run professionally.
Yeah. So, as I say, Bletchley Park's an interesting place. We're covering the National Radio Centre here, but there's lots and lots of other things to see here as well. So, Tony, how long have you been a volunteer here?
Well, first of all, I've been a member of the Radio Society of Great Britain for 40 years now, and I've been a member of the guide. I do a guided tour session around the park as well during the weekdays, but on the weekends I come here, and I've been here since the radio centre opened about 5 years ago.
All right, well, congratulations on 40 years, and looks like you enjoy yourself. You have a big smile on your face, sir.
We certainly do. It's a huge commitment, but we enjoy every minute of it, and we meet so many nice people, and also the younger people that come along. They're very interested in modern technology, and also just to keep the interest up, we also give them a Morse code test and give them a certificate when they've been proficient.
Yeah, I do a similar thing on HMS Belfast, but the Morse certificate is something that's really worth doing, and it involves youngsters, so that's a good one, Tony.
Yes, it does, and we're very happy to see them any day of the week. That's right, yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for your time. I'm going to let you get back to operating, and the room's getting a bit full and noisy, so hopefully you're going to get some more people to talk to.
Yes, thank you very much for that. And just just one last point on the visitors, we're now seeing about 400 visitors on average every day of the week coming into the radio centre at Bletchley Park. as well as the people who are visiting the park for other reasons. But it's very encouraging, and we try to make it interesting to spread our word.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly interesting, Tony, because I've had a look round, and it's certainly very, very interesting. Well worth a visit. So thank you very much.
It was very nice talking to you. Thank you.